Salmon is really the heart of our culture. You know, we're salmon people.
Danila Miller is a member of Yakima Nation, and for her, salmon are much more than just fish.
When we're born, you know, we drink our mother's milk, but salmon was always our first food. That was the first solid food that I ate. And so it's our responsibility to care for them.
Miller is also fisheries science manager for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission.
Evaluating the hatchery programs. We have a genetics lab in southern Idaho, and we have a river ecology project.
She's had a front row seat as salmon populations have declined over the last several decades. To understand the threats facing salmon, you have to understand the complexity of their life cycle.
They're a highly migratory species. They begin life hatching in the upper portions of watersheds in tributaries of the system. And they move their way down out of those tributaries into the major river systems. They then find their way to the estuaries. They go to the ocean to mature. Right.
Kim Kratz is an assistant regional administrator with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They're the federal agency charged with overseeing salmon recovery. And he explains that throughout their lives, salmon face threats at nearly every turn.
Traditionally, we looked at the threats to salmon by the 4 H's. There's habitat, there's harvest, there's hatcheries, and there's the hydro system.
More recently, sea lions and predatory birds have been added to the list of threats.
And then there's climate change. And climate change adds and increases the risk to all of those 4 H's.
It's a complex issue, and you can't pinpoint one specific thing. I always refer to it as death by 1,000 cuts.
While salmon face many threats, dams stand out among them. Each of the dozens of dams throughout the Columbia and Willamette River system present an obstacle to salmon. They're hard to pass for young fish who are following the current out to the Pacific. And they're just as hard to get by for adult salmon, trying to navigate back to their spawning grounds.
We are constantly evaluating.
That's where Tim Dykstra comes in. He's in charge of making sure salmon can get past the dams.
And in the case of the Army Corps of Engineer dams on the 4 lower Columbia and the 4 lower Snake dams, they all have effective fish ladders that quickly and effectively pass adult fish back to their spawning grounds.
Dykstra said the Army Corps has changed its operations so that fewer young salmon die passing through the turbines.
So we've installed major infrastructure upgrades, screens that divert fish from entering the turbines. We've provided a lot of spill at the spillway at the dams so that they have non-turbine routes to pass.
But dams do more than just create barriers for salmon. They create low-cost, carbon-free electricity, and they facilitate shipping and irrigation for farmers.
We recognize there are impacts of dams, we recognize there are benefits of dams, and we take our fish and wildlife responsibilities very seriously.
But dams also fundamentally change how the river flows.
The great river of the West tearing toward the sea at Salo Falls.
Those falls were the water purifiers.
Wilbur Slockish Jr. is an elder with the Klickitat Band of Yakima Nation. He remembers fishing at Salo Falls, a series of thundering cascades that used to be east of the Dalles.
Oh, man, that's a sound that can't be replicated. And the fish, there was plenty of fish all the time because the water was cold, free-flowing.
Today, the falls are quiet, inundated when the dams went up.
They flooded spawning beds behind Bonneville Dam, where our people fished.
And that gets to another big threat for salmon: habitat loss. Along the coast, tidal estuaries have been converted to pastures. Further inland, vast wetland areas have been cut off from the river. The Polensky Wildlife Area, just north of Portland on the backwaters of the Willamette, is one of those areas. A few years ago, it was more than 400 acres of disconnected habitat, parts of it cut off from the river for nearly a century by culverts and water diversions.
What we did here was we actually lowered over about a 4.5 acre area. We actually brought down the marsh plain about 2.5 feet. And so this
Tom Josephson, with the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force, helped lead the restoration project in the wildlife area.
And so now fish can get from that slough channel into these wetland areas back in here, and it provides a lot more landscape connectivity across the site.
And his agency worked closely with the Bonneville Power Administration, which runs the hydropower side of the dams on the Columbia River.
It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Jason Karnezis leads the estuary program for BPA, And he says projects like this one are meant to offset the damage that dams do.
As a federal agency, you take the responsibility of recognizing the impacts that you have on the environment. You put that work on the ground as best you can according to the science.
And while the work will be good for salmon, he stressed that it's about more than that.
So we're trying to restore processes, not just a specific one-size-fits-all habitat for salmonids.
Whether habitat restoration projects like this one will work will take time to tell. But Karnezis is confident.
We've documented those things over time and have found that the adage of if you build it, they will come is true.
But even some programs created to help salmon haven't quite worked out as planned. Since the late 1800s, people have been using salmon hatcheries to augment fish stocks.
What we try to do, what hatcheries are intended to do, is to boost harvest opportunities while at the same time reducing the risk to ESA-listed fish.
But intent and reality don't always align. Kratz said that hatchery fish have altered genetics, giving those salmon lower chances of survival.
It seems like they're less able to respond to some of the threats that they've got because they have a more homogeneous set of DNA.
And you don't need to be a scientist to notice the difference between hatchery and wild fish.
The fish have gotten smaller since they put into those little salmon reservations called hatcheries.
The real danger, though, comes if hatchery fish breed with their wild counterparts, passing along those inferior genes. Kratz said hatchery managers are careful about when they release hatchery fish to limit their interaction with wild salmon. But the idea that hatcheries could bring salmon back from the brink has proven false.
You know, it used to be that we thought that hatcheries were a direct replacement for declining fish populations, and now we realize that hatcheries provide an important benefit and they can be used for conservation, but they're not the silver bullet.
So with threats coming at salmon from all sides, why are people still allowed to fish for them? Simply put, salmon are foundational for a big part of the Northwest economy.
These fisheries provide tens of thousands of jobs. There are hundreds of communities that are reliant for a resilient economy on these fisheries.
But they're also more than that.
They're part of the fabric of the West Coast region with respect to culture and the economy. With respect to the indigenous people, it's part of they're inextricable from their culture, from their economy, from their art, from their ceremony.
And that's what makes the issue so personal for people like Wilbur Slockish and Danilo Miller.
All of this is really emotional for me because it's part of who I am and my culture.
And it's that cultural connection that keeps Miller working to save salmon.
And I see it as carrying on the work of my elders and my ancestors and, and setting the stage for our future generations to continue on this work to, protect our environment.
Despite the setbacks, there have been signs of progress. Some runs like Oregon Coast Coho and Hood Canal Chum have shown promising signs of recovery. And the biggest dam removal in U.S. history is currently underway on the Klamath River, which will restore access to hundreds of miles of salmon habitat. But for true change to happen, Miller says it will take a fundamental shift in how people interact with their environment.
The tribal perspective that I grew up with, that I was taught by my ancestors, is that our natural resources were put here to sustain us, and so it's our responsibility to care for them and ensure their existence for future generations.
The Endangered Species Act, for all the good it's done, won't be enough.
I think it has the potential that it could be the most powerful tool that we have to protect species from extinction, but we've really yet to see the success of that. All of these species listed in the 90s in the Columbia River Basin, how many of those have been restored?
Slockish knows he'll never see salmon runs like his ancestors did, but he still remembers the first salmon he ever caught and the message it delivered.
Just like looked me in the eye, and I looked at him, and I got the message there. I did my job. Now you do yours. You take care of me.